Hi you guys, Kirkland here. I'm back to do Tome 12, Discordance. Let's get started.
Talbot opens his eyes in a daze, sitting in a wooden chair, slowly returning from a journey half remembered. He remembers the flowers and luminous colors, blue and purple, glowing and dripping with a strange nectar-like fluid. The strange blue and purple flowers from another world. He heaves a groggy sigh and isn't sure if he traveled at the speed of thought to defy time and experience a moment from the future, or if it was all some elaborate fantasy, put together by his imagination with an unremembered assortment of past memories. Either way, it felt real, and that, for the time being, was enough. Talbot glances at the poppy in his hand. Incredible how a single flower can take you on such a journey, through realms within, and possible realms without, through realms unknown. "You're back, Mr. Grimes." Talbot turns with a start to face Junius, an investor in the company. He despised everything about this man, how he presented himself in his black suit and waxed mustache, how he looked at him, how he had to justify everything he wanted to do with him and his brethren in terms of profit. "What are you doing here?" "We need your, how shall I say, expertise to help us collect samples in a remote location in northern Africa." "I'm afraid I'm on another assignment, but I'm sure you're able to send in the other chemists." "We have." "And?" "They disappeared, along with several other expeditions we've sent in." Talbot turned away, taking in a basement filled with black smoke and the drowsy scent of opium, urine, sweat, and vomit. The den was lined with 2 rows of straw mattress beds, accompanied by little tables with nut oil lamps to heat up the opium before placing it into a pipe as long as a rifle. Men groan and grin with their eyes shut. One man stares at Talbot and laughs slowly and heavily with a pipe to his lips. Every time he pulls at the burning opium pellet, there is a hellish frying sound. Junius clears his throat. "Understand, Mr. Grimes, there is no assignment more critical for the company than this one." And by critical, Talbot understands he means profitable. Junius hadn't been exactly right. There had been a chemist who had returned from the expedition, an old friend and rival from school, Tomas. Tomas had returned from his journey into the bleed, as Junius called it, without uttering a single word about anything he had seen or experienced. In fact, he hadn't uttered a single word since his return. And as Junius explains how he hopes an old friend would stimulate Tomas, he marches along the grimy London road, leading Talbot to Tomas's home. Within minutes they approach the entrance of a modest dwelling, and Junius knocks hard. A doctor opens the door and greets them both, explaining how Tomas has gone to pieces and that no one can get anything out of him. The doctor then leads them to a small, dank room where Talbot's old school friend sits at the edge of a bed, rocking nervously. A candle on a nearby table illuminates him in the darkness. With slow steps, Talbot approaches Tomas. Horrified by the haggard face and the empty eyes staring up at him, he proceeds to sit on a stool beside him. "My dead old friend. I only heard a few days ago you were back from quite an assignment, as I've been made to understand." Tomas doesn't answer, but his eyes brim with sudden tears. "It's okay. You can tell me what happened." Tomas tries to speak, but only mumbles incoherently. After a moment, a tear slips down his pale cheek, and he manages to point a trembling finger at a cabinet. Talbot stands, brushes past Junius, and grabs a leather satchel. He opens it and pulls out a journal and shows it to Tomas. Tomas nods and struggles to speak, but his eyes suddenly widen, and instead of words he releases a hellish scream that grows louder and louder with every breath. Panicked, the doctor rushes in, quickly escorting them out of the room, as Talbot gives his friend one last trailing look and wonders what could have broken such a stoic and brilliant mind. Talbot sits in a horse-drawn carriage reading the notebooks. Nothing but gibberish and the disturbing thoughts of a chemist losing his mind. If he were to believe the notebooks, Tomas had lived an eternity in a world where people were constantly hunted like game by apparitions pulled out of dark folk tales. He had only disappeared a week, and yet there were hundreds of entries, perhaps thousands. It made little to no sense. Neither did Junius. He had misjudged the money man. He was a lot more compassionate than he had anticipated, and he seemed to express genuine sympathy for Tomas. Despite being obsessed with profit, he is really quite human. It dawns on Talbot that Junius might in fact be two people, and that the company does a strange thing to him, acting almost like a catalyst. He seems to be different when representing the company. It seems as though the company affords him something which allows him to be someone else entirely. Perhaps protection, perhaps anonymity, perhaps both. Talbot suspects the same may be said of him with his pursuits, but somehow he's sure that even with the protection and anonymity of the company, he manages to retain his compassion for others. And yet, he goes through his friend's notebooks less from a position of grief and more from a position of curiosity. He wonders if this objective disposition makes him less human, or perhaps more human. Any beast can react in anger or rage or grief. What sets us apart from animals is our intellect, our ability to stand above our emotions for the greater good. And yet, Talbot cannot help but entertain the thought that what sets humans apart from machines is our emotions. No, not emotions. Our empathy. Our ability to feel what others feel just by imagining what they might be going through, what they might be suffering. That is an ability above and beyond the simple mechanisms of the intellect. What an incredible power it is to be able to put ourselves in another person's shoes. It's why theater and poetry and stories can even exist. Without empathy, the human experience would have to be redefined as something else, something smaller, something closer to that of an insect. And yet, it's the empathy variable that seems to be the great obstacle to achieving true objectivity, to achieving truth. But what's the use of true objectivity if it means losing one's humanity? Talbot isn't sure how long he's been in this small dinghy up the river under a scorching white African sun with an escort of soldiers, company soldiers. The company's so big it is one of the largest mercenary forces in the world. Impressive, really. And secretly, he admires the fact that they do what they want when they want, without consequence or fear of tarnishing the reputation of king and country. He stares at the soldiers as they lounge about the stern, young, callous men who found a place to hunt, kill, and torture human beings with anonymity. The cook, Oswald, talks about rebellions he's put down in various colonies, as well as the wonderful dishes he's discovered from other lands. Calder is a known tracker who's captured several dissidents and showed us a collection of severed ears he took from the scoundrels. Dallin fills the silences with stories about his fiancée. She's beautiful and fun and from a good family, and Talbot senses he speaks aloud more to convince himself about his affections for her than anyone else. He's torn between her and his love of soldiering, and somehow understands he can't have both. She'll ask him too many questions, make him think about things he'd rather not think about, and remind him of his better self. Talbot knows the feeling all too well. He was in love once too, Ina. But his love for her wasn't enough, at least not enough for him to turn his back on his experiments. She was jealous of his work, of his lab, all the time he spent there, all the energy and thought he gave his experiments. When Ina smashed the lab to pieces and set it ablaze, he immediately understood how much she loved him. And seeing his destroyed lab, he immediately felt the pain and misery he was causing her. And he didn't want to experience those feelings anymore, or the guilt. Riding a camel under a blistering sun, Talbot wipes beads of sweat from his brow and follows Calder and the other soldiers to a sprawling camp of tents covered in sand. They quickly halt as a man in desert attire approaches them, introducing himself as Farley. Talbot dismounts, and they exchange pleasantries. Then Talbot follows Farley across the camp, past countless cooking fires surrounded by whispering company men, and into the largest tent. Farley turns to Talbot.
I would like to say that all this is not, how should I put it, conventional. What I share with you must never be spoken of with anyone else.
Talbot nods slightly. Farley walks over to the back of the tent and lifts a flap to reveal a huge mass of black fog in the distance. Strange purple and blue light emanates from within. What is that? What am I looking at? Farley stares at the mass of fog.
We refer to it as the bleed. A theory put forward is that it could be another dimension, how should I say, spilling into our own. We have seen and noted these phenomena before, but never for this long, never enough to explore. We need you to enter, take notes, and collect samples of flora and fauna should you find any.
Talbot peers intently at the barrier of fog. You believe this to be another dimension?
We don't know what to think, and that is precisely why we sent for you, Mr. Grimes.
You could have chosen more experienced chemists. There are several.
We did. They never returned, and we are certainly concerned for their well-being. But if you could find a way to collect and bring back samples from this anomaly, their sacrifice would not have been in vain.
Talbot furrows his brow. Farley sighs, closes the flap, and faces Talbot.
We would even consider your proposal to improve, how should I say, the quality of your experiments. That is to say, we could certainly find a way to give you access to the test subjects you desire.
The king would have our heads.
My dear Mr. Grimes, we do not answer to the king.
We do not answer to the king. Talbot considers the implications of those words over and over again as he prepares his leather satchel with his notebook, tools, and vials. He then closes the satchel and wonders who in fact the company answers to if not the king. Junius had once told him the company was like a person and was given the same respect as a person, and yet the company didn't seem like a person. It seemed like something else, something different, something perhaps like a beast pretending to be a person, a dark thing unleashed into the world to destroy and plunder and return to its masters with a mouthful of death and a fistful of gold. A part of Talbot hated being a part of this dark thing for the longest time, but over the years he had found a way to rise above his guilt and admire the sheer power and brilliance of what it could do in the world and what it could achieve for its masters without reproach. When the beast became a problem, the masters could simply end its life abruptly, burying the beast in all the pain, death, and horror it had caused in a forgotten grave. But not the gold, not the plunder. They, the masters, could keep it all. Keep the gold and the plunder, and eventually use it to inject life into a new beast, or perhaps beasts. The company may not have been a person, but it was certainly a form of life, and gold was its life force, its blood. Talbot suddenly feels inspired. Gold is energy. No, not gold. Currency. Currency is energy. No, not energy. A variable to direct and control people, to manipulate the fold. Yes. There is something worth exploring in the thought. Something worth pursuing. Something that could help the company and its masters. He asks himself if there is a way to understand people in reduced terms. In terms of energy and equations. Talbot quickly pulls out his notebook and jots down a concept. Fold energy. He scribbles down an equation, crosses it out, then rewrites another version. He examines the equation, then releases a sigh and crosses it out again. He wonders for a long moment if people could actually be reduced to a chemical equation that could somehow determine output and potential. It was a strange idea, perhaps even an awful idea, and yet this idea had legs like a beast. It was certainly plausible to treat people as a kind of energy that could be contained and controlled, except for one variable, the human variable, empathy. The strength of currency as a variable to control, manipulate, and predict energy flow would be directly proportional to the value people placed on the currency in their lives. But there had to be ways to remove or reduce the human variable, to somehow turn currency into a collective god, or in the very least, a demigod, something the Fold feared, prayed to, and constantly meditated on. One single god to control them all, one single variable to stimulate, shock, and direct Fold energy. Talbot stares at his notebook and laughs to himself. The idea is ludicrous. There are no legs. There's no present or future world where he or anyone else could experiment on eliminating the human variable. Such a thing not even the company could get away with. But if it could, it would be far more powerful and effective at controlling the Fold than any king or empire. Talbot scratches out his equations, realizing they are nothing more than highly imaginative scribbles masquerading as science. Even if the company were granted the ability to experiment on the Fold without limits, he could not imagine how this intangible human variable could be reduced, let alone removed from the equation. All the cultures and communities and diverging beliefs and values would never allow such a god or demigod to exist. Shaking his head at the absurdity of his theory, Talbot closes his notebook, places it in his satchel, and prepares for the journey to come. Talbot leads his retinue toward a wall of fog, ignoring the gasps and sighs behind him. He stops in his tracks just before entering. Oswald announces that he thinks they should all turn back, and that if they do, he'll make them a wonderful dish he learned in India. Calder says the money they are paying him makes turning back impossible. Dallin agrees with Calder. Talbot takes note of the comment, then extends a finger and pokes the almost liquid fog. And the fog extends a tendril and pokes him back. In disbelief, Talbot pokes the fog again to see if he'll stimulate a similar response. But the fog doesn't poke back. The first time was possibly just a reaction to their collective body heat. The thought of conscious mist or fog almost seems absurd. He stares at the fog for a long moment, then hears Ina's voice calling out his name from within the bleed. He sighs, ignores the voice, and for a moment regrets the swig of laudanum he took to calm his heart and focus his thoughts. Then, as the men continue to gasp and whisper concerns about the fog, Talbot closes his eyes and takes one small step into the unknown. Talbot opens his eyes to find himself staring at strange, luminous blue and purple vines attached to volcanic rock formations he strangely recognizes. Large crows he barely recognizes circle and caw in the dark sky. Two company soldiers step up beside him, with their eyes wide with disbelief. Talbot turns to Calder and Oswald. He scrutinizes the passage of fog behind them, waiting for Dallin to push through. "Where's your friend?" Calder and Oswald realize they lost Dallin and proceed to wave the fog and call out his name. Then Calder moves into the fog, but Talbot grabs his shoulder, stopping him.
We are not where we think we are.
Calder pulls away from Talbot.
I'm not sure what that's supposed to mean.
We can't just leave him. Talbot approaches the fog separating them from the camp.
My thoughts are that he turned and returned to camp.
Calder and Oswald exchange a look with Talbot. Then Calder steps forward and leads them into the blue and purple gloom. They soon approach a wall of vines with a luminous blue nectar-like substance flowing through veins blocking their path. Talbot reaches up and gently pulls a petal from a small flower and places it in a vial. Calder withdraws a machete with a high-pitched ring, and the vines seem to suddenly tremble. Talbot senses something amiss and grabs Calder's arm mid-swing.
Not the best idea.
Nonsense! Calder yanks his arm free and savagely cuts a path through the vines as a purple substance splatters all over him. Instantly, the butchered vines shrivel up and disintegrate like embers into small puffs of fog. Talbot watches with his mouth hanging as the other vines seem to retract from Calder, as though conscious of his lethal intentions. They seem to be retreating from a threat. Calder nudges Talbot and gestures for him to snap out of his trance. But as he takes a step forward, the volcanic rock below his feet suddenly cracks open. Black fog spews out, and a thick vine slithers out and touches Calder's boot. Before Talbot can stop him, Calder stamps the vine like a snake. He laughs and shakes his head as the vine snaps alive, wraps around his ankle, and rips his leg off with impossible power. A fountain of hot arterial blood sprays the cold darkness as Calder screams in agony. Talbot swallows hard as Oswald panics to help the tracker. He moves past the screaming man and stares at the retreating vines with mingled curiosity and disbelief. It might be that this other realm is very much conscious, a living realm, analyzing and testing them. To what purpose, he isn't sure, but screams suddenly interrupt Talbot's thoughts. He turns on Calder and suppresses an impulse to yell at him. He's likely in excruciating pain and didn't mean the interruption. He quickly puts on an expression of concern and kneels by his trembling body, wondering how long a person can live without a leg. Oswald cries that they should take him back to camp, but Talbot's unwilling to compromise his one opportunity to observe and study what no chemist has ever observed or studied before. Yet he doesn't want to waste time arguing with Oswald. He simply wouldn't understand. He tells Oswald he needs to dress Calder's wounds before they can carry him back to camp. Oswald nods agreement as Talbot withdraws a bottle of laudanum, his concoction, a mixture more powerful than anything any company has ever produced. He places the bottle to Calder's lips, tells him the serum will ease the pain, and he proceeds to pour the contents down his trembling mouth. Within moments, Calder stops shaking, and his eyes roll back as he issues his last breath. Talbot allows a small grin, and he suddenly feels the barrel of a pistol at the base of his head.
What did you do to my friend?
Talbot closes his eyes and waits for death. Oswald shouts at Talbot, calling him a bloody murderer. As his finger curls around the trigger, a massive cloud of fog rushes up to him and grabs him like a fist and pulls him, kicking and screaming, into the darkness. Talbot stands on shaking legs, staring at the scene incredulously. It was as though this realm was protecting him. It was as though it was keeping him alive for some unknown reason. He felt a sudden pang of guilt for Calder and Oswald, and then it was gone, and he began to follow the spiraling path of jagged rock illuminated by luminous vines and flowers. He followed it for a long while when he heard her voice again. It couldn't be. Ina. He stopped, turned round and round, searching desperately. This time he was sure it wasn't the laudanum. It was this place. It wasn't protecting him. It was messing with him, playing with him like a cat does a mouse. He closes his eyes, covers his ears, and continues to follow the spiraling purple path. Luminous blue droplets drip from a canopy of blooming flowers. A petal falls, and he tracks its movement and catches it in midair. He examines the round shape, smooth texture, and places it in a vial. Then he grabs another vial and begins to catch droplets of this otherworldly fluid, wondering if, like the poppy, it could open doorways within the mind. A strangled gasp suddenly breaks the almost palpable silence. He searches the small twisted trees and shrubs, and soon finds Oswald with his back against a boulder, sucking in quick, shallow breaths, covering a wound in his stomach with his hand. He looks up at Talbot.
Quick, please. It's coming back for me.
Talbot is torn between helping him and moving on.
What's coming for you? What did this to you?
Talbot takes a shuddering breath and kneels beside Oswald, opening his satchel and searching for thread to stitch him up.
It's hunting us. The man-beast. Nothing hurts it. Nothing. I shot it, cut it, stabbed it, and it continued after me.
Save your strength.
I found the others. They're alive. This thing. It's making something with them.
Talbot retrieves the thread and begins to stitch up the gash. He turns to the satchel, and his eyes take in the luminous blue fluid he collected from the vines and flowers. He's not sure what it does, and he knows it will be a while before he does. Talbot stares at Oswald. He can't do it. He shouldn't do it, and yet, this is an emergency. He must do what he can to help him, even if it means taking a chance on an untested serum. He almost has no choice. He hesitates, then grabs the vial and stares at it. He knows he's lying to himself. He knows there are other ways to help him. But he also knows the company hasn't officially accepted his proposal for human experimentation. Human experimentation could take a long time, a real long time, and he doesn't have a long time. It might be years before he gets another chance like this. He could administer a drop, just a drop, and see what medicinal properties the nectar-like secretion may or may not have. The secretion is a gift from another world. Last thing he wants is to spend years staring at the vial collecting dust on a wooden shelf in his laboratory, while the company debates the merits of his proposal. In fact, they'll be grateful he took the initiative. Slowly, he lowers the vial to the wound. He tilts the lip slightly and lets a tiny drop slip out into the sticky wound. He waits for his blood to absorb the secretion and watches ever closely. At first, nothing seems to happen. Then, all at once, Oswald's face twists in horror as his body warps. A fiery blue light burns through him as blue and purple sacs begin to cover his body. Talbot stares, amazed. He's never seen anything like it. It's incredible. One drop shocked his entire system within a few minutes. The mutation and energy release alone seemed impossible, and yet there it was, right in front of him. Oswald screams as one boil after another erupts with purple pus. Amazement turns to fear as Talbot stares at the ghastly sight and realizes what he's done to the cook. His mind searches desperately for ways to help the poor man, but there's nothing he can do. Over the screams, he hears Ina's disembodied voice echoing behind him. "Talbot, dear, what have you done? What have you done?" Talbot scrambles back on his heels, then turns and charges through the madness of this impossible world with a maelstrom of conflicting emotions rushing through him. What have I done? What have I done? Talbot shambles through thick vines and clambers over rocks and corpses blooming with luminous flowers. He tumbles to the ground and tells himself it was for the greater good, that the cook was probably going to die anyway, that he's doing something important, that he's searching for chemicals and compounds potent enough to transport people to other worlds at the speed of thought. The speed of thought is the only way to travel between worlds, and the doors to these unseen and unknown worlds are within, and any effort in trying to find those keys far outweigh the life of a cook. Desperately, he clambers to his feet and finds himself surrounded by a living mass of black fog. He stares at it intently, and his panicking mind calms with amazement as he finds himself staring at tiny cells that undulate together like some sort of vaporous membrane. Then, the fog slowly dissipates to reveal a tree covered in thick black leaves. Talbot stares at the tree and begins to notice the trunk writhing and realizes it's made of people. He realizes in amazement that he has found the missing employees. He begins a slow march toward this tree of death, with his eyes wide and his jaw hanging. It's beautiful and horrific at the same time. It's sublime. It's the only word that comes to mind. As Talbot approaches the gnarled tree, the black leaves suddenly take flight, revealing themselves to be massive crows. He gazes skyward and watches the crows disappear into the darkness. Then he hears the crunch of stone and quickly lowers his gaze to find himself face to face with the man-beast. The creature stares at Talbot with a gaping mouth and glowing blue eyes, as though recognizing him. It hesitates and seems conflicted as it peers into his disbelieving eyes. Suddenly, the creature shrieks something horrible, and vines burst out of its hands and wrap around his chest, squeezing the breath out of him until he slowly drifts into nothingness. With a gasp, Talbot opens his eyes, alone in the desert, under a blistering sun with no sense of the passage of time. He remembers pulling himself off the tree. He remembers someone crying out to him for help. He remembers taking samples as everything evaporated before his eyes. Then he remembers walking and collapsing under a scorching white sun, wondering if he was going to suddenly wake up in another world, or perhaps in an opium den. Talbot struggles to sit up as a mirage of men on camels gallop toward him. He looks down to his clenched fist, opening it slowly to reveal a blue and purple flower.
Alright, you guys, I'm going to make that part 1 of Tome 12, and I'll be right back with part 2. Until then, this is Kirkland signing out. Take care, everybody. Bye for now.